Well, hello there! I'm back! And today we have another episode of Beauty and the Bibliophile. If you're new here, welcome to my channel. I'm Leia. If you're not new here, thank you for returning. As often as I can, I do a series called Beauty and the Bibliophile, where I do my makeup and I tell you about the latest book that I've read. Today's book is The Princess and the Goblin by George MacDonald, and this came out in 1872. So it's a pretty old fairy tale, which I like. I like the old fairy tales. I think the lessons are simple to understand, but thought-provoking and important. Before we get started, spoiler alerts. If you are thinking about reading this book and you don't want to know anything about it, don't watch this video. I can't cover everything in the book for the sake of time, but you will know the ending. If you just want to hear a summary of the book and watch me do my makeup at the same time, well then this would be a good video for you. So let's get started. Okay, so The Princess and the Goblin. And this was written by George MacDonald in 1872. Also, if you're curious about any of the products that I'm using, I will be listing them in the description box below. So there once was a little princess whose father was king of a great kingdom. And this kingdom was full of mountains and valleys and was very beautiful. The king had many castles in his kingdom. The main castle that he lived in was on top of a mountain and was very grand. And the princess, whose name was Irene, was born there, but she soon had to be sent away to one of his other castles because her mother, the queen, was too sick and weak to take care of her. So she was sent to one of his other castles and was raised by country people in a house that was half castle, half farmhouse. And this castle was on a mountain as well, about halfway between the base and its peak. Okay, I'm gonna let my skincare sit in for a few minutes before we move on to makeup. Now the princess was a sweet little girl, and she was about 8 years old at the time of this story. Her nursery was painted very beautifully. The ceiling was painted dark blue and had little stars painted all over it. And it was painted this way because she was never allowed to see the real thing, because she was never allowed to go outside at nighttime. Now these mountains were full of hollow places and caverns and winding ways, and some parts had water in them. And the people of the country would mine these caves for the ore. And in the subterranean caverns were a race of beings called goblins. The legend was that these beings at one time lived above ground much like people do. But for some reason, there's different theories, the king at the time became very severe with these group of people and started taxing them and requiring them to observe certain holidays, and just became very severe with them. They had to follow laws that the other people didn't have to. And because of this, they all kind of left the kingdom and disappeared. Now, according to the legend, these creatures had taken refuge in the subterranean caverns of the mountain, and they never came out except at night. And nobody ever saw one, let alone a group of them. But if they had, it was usually in the most difficult parts of the mountain to reach. And most of the people who said they saw a goblin had actually only seen some of their domesticated animals. But we'll talk more about them later. Now, these goblins were a very clever and mischievous race, and they took great delight in annoying their upstairs neighbors. They collectively held a grudge against them, but especially against the descendants of the king who had caused their expulsion. Now, over time, the goblins had created a government for themselves, and the chief goal of this government, besides, the day-to-day affairs, was to cause trouble for their upstairs neighbors. And so this is why Princess Irene could never go outside at night. Now, one rainy day, the princess is in her nursery and she's playing with her toys, but she's very bored. She would have rather been outside playing. Now, in her nursery, there was this door. Besides the main door that you used to get in and out of the nursery, there was this other door, almost, probably looked like a closet door or something. And behind this door was a set of stairs. Now, the princess had been up these stairs once. She only made it about 6 steps and got scared and turned back around. But today, she was so bored that she was willing to, brave the staircase and see if she could see what was at the top. So she goes up the stairs and she seems to be climbing the stairs for a very long time. But when she gets to the 3rd flight, she sees that there's a hallway going out from the stairs there. So in this hallway, along both sides on the walls, were a line of doors on both sides. And she walks down to the end of the hallway where there's then another passageway. And again, it's just more and more doors. She takes a couple more turns, more doors. She also realizes it's very quiet, so I guess there's nobody behind these doors doing anything. And that thought kind of frightens the princess. So she turns around to go back to the nursery. And she takes a couple turns, can't find the stairs. Takes a few more turns, still can't find the stairs. She runs and she runs, and she can never find the stairs. So she realizes that she's lost, and she starts crying. So she's in the hallway crying, and then she hears the sound of humming. And at first, she thought it was rain, but it didn't sound exactly like rain. So she goes up to the doors and she starts putting her ear up to every door, trying to see if she can find where this sound is coming from. She finds a door that she thinks the sound is coming from, so she opens the door and she peeks inside. And she sees an old lady sitting at a spinning wheel spinning. At least she thinks she's old. She has a beautiful pale skin. Her hair is long, but it's white as snow, not Snow White. And even though her face was smooth, no wrinkles, her eyes were very wise. So Irene thought that this lady must be old, maybe even 50. But she was quite older than that, as we shall see. Now, when this old lady saw Princess Irene, she goes, "Oh, my dear, come in, come in." And she asks the princess, she's like, "Why have you been crying, my child?" And she says, "Well, 'cause I got lost." So the lady, she cleans her face, wipes her tears, and she says, "Do you know what my name is?" And the princess is like, "No." She says, "My name is Irene." And the little princess is like, "Oh, well, that's my name." And the old lady's like, "I know, I'm the one that gave it to you." She says, "I haven't got your name, you've got my name. And you know what else?" she says, "I'm your great-great-grandmother." And Princess Irene is like, "What?" The old lady says, "I'm your father's mother's father's mother." And the princess is like, "I don't get it. She's only 8. And the old lady says, "Well, I'll explain it to you when you get older." But she says, "I'm here to take care of you." And the princess is like, "Well, how long have you been here? I've never seen you before." And the old lady says that she's been there as long as Princess Irene has been there. And Princess Irene says, "Well, why hasn't my nurse ever told me about you?" And the old lady says, "Well, nobody knows I'm here." Then the old lady said, you better get back before people start worrying about you." And Princess Irene is like, "Okay, I can't wait to tell my nurse about you. And that I've met my grandmother." And her grandmother says, "That's great." She's like, "You do just that." And then she took her back to her room. And when Princess Irene got back to her room, her nurse was there frantically looking for her. And when she saw her, she was like, "Where have you been?" And Irene was like, "Oh, I've been upstairs and I met my great mother." But the nurse thought she was just making up stories. But Princess Irene insisted that it was the truth. She told her she wanted to take her upstairs and show her. But her nurse told her, "You know, I'm very busy today." She's like, "Why don't you take me up there tomorrow?" The next morning, Irene was kind of thinking about it, and she was like, wasn't sure if her grandmother would be upset if she brought her nurse, who she calls Ludi, by the way, up to see her unannounced. So she convinced her nurse to take her outside for a walk instead. And the nurse had actually completely forgot about what she said anyway. They took a nice long walk about a mile up the mountain. And all of a sudden, the sun started to set. And Ludi freaked out a little bit. The day had gotten away from them. So she grabs Irene's hand and she starts heading down the mountain back towards the castle. It was against orders to have the princess out a moment past sundown. And if the king found out, Ludi would certainly lose her job. Not to mention the fact that Ludi was terrified of running into any goblins. The nurse and Irene are hand in hand running down the mountain. But Irene didn't understand why her nurse was in such a hurry and frightened. Irene didn't know there was anything to be frightened of. And as they ran, Irene thought she saw a man peeking out from behind a rock. But as they ran past it, she realized it was just the shape of rock. Then she thought she saw another man standing at the foot of a tree. And as Irene is seeing this, Ludi sees it at the same time, and this frightens her even more, and she picks up the pace, and Irene's having a hard time keeping up with her. Now, Irene didn't understand what her nurse was so frightened of, because all the servants had very strict orders never to mention goblins to the princess. So she didn't even know that goblins existed. And right as Irene was starting to get pretty frightened by her nurse's behavior, they heard a boy coming down the road singing. And he was singing, "Ring dong bang, go the hammers clang, where the merry miner boys make the goblins hold their noise." As he came closer to Irene and her nurse was like shushing him, telling him to be quiet, because she didn't want the goblins to hear them. But he ignored her and he kept singing. And right as he got like right next to them, he was like, "There, that'll do it. That'll keep them away." He says they can't stand singing because they can't sing themselves. Boy was dressed like a miner. And Irene thought he was a very nice looking boy with eyes as dark as the mines in which he worked and as sparkly as the crystals in the rock. He told Ludi and Irene that he had seen the goblins and that he could tell they were after somebody. But he told them not to worry. As long as they were with him, the goblins wouldn't bother them. And Ludi's like, "Well, why is that?" And he says that, "Well, because I'm not afraid of them. If you're not afraid of them, then they are afraid of you. At least up here. Down in the mountains where they live, that's a different story." Then Irene, hearing this first mention of goblins ever, became frightened. She told her nurse that she wanted to go home. And Ludi picks her up and she looks at the boy and she goes, "Stop frightening the princess." And the boy's like, "The princess?" He's like, "Oh, I'm sorry." He's like, "But you're not supposed to be out so late. Everyone knows it's against the law." He's like, "You come with me." He's like, "I'll make sure you get home safe." So the three of them head down the mountain. They each have one of Irene's hands. And Irene asks the boy, she says, "What's your name?" And he tells her that his name is Curdy. So they reached the castle safely. And Irene and her nurse, they go in through a back door. Nobody had missed them. They didn't even know that they went out at all. So her nurse goes in through this back door, and right before Irene goes in, she throws her arms around Curdy's neck and she goes to give him a kiss. But her nurse grabs her and pulls her away. She's like, princesses do not give kisses. She's like, it's not proper. And Irene is like, but he's a nice boy and he was brave and he helped us. And her nurse says, doesn't matter. Plus, he's only a minor boy. And Curdy was like, oh, it's okay, princess. You don't have to give me a kiss tonight. He was like, maybe I'll see you again sometime. And Irene was like, oh yes, that would be great. And then Curdy, he turns around and he takes off into the night. Now the next day, Curdy decided to stay late in the mines to earn some extra money. And as he was taking a little break, he was leaning up against the cave wall, he heard voices. And there was no mistaking it was goblin voices. Now Curdy could hear that it was a family of goblins and that they were gossiping about their queen and about how she wore shoes unlike all the other goblins, just like the people above. And she did it because she had the ugliest feet, just like the people above, how her foot split into 5 different little pieces. And the little kid goblin was like, oh, she doesn't wear them because our feet are our weakest point? And their family's like, no, she does it because her feet are so ugly. Then the father goblin told his family that, he needed to get going, that there was a meeting at the palace he needed to attend. They were going to be discussing the plans for the humans above. Then their voices started to trail off like they were walking away from Curdy. So Curdy learned 2 important things here. 1, that the goblins were planning something against the humans. And 2, that their feet were their weakest point. Now Curdy needed to find out what this plan was. So he very quickly but quietly made his way through the cave wall and into this goblin family's house, who was out of sight now, but still within ear's reach. And he followed them through many passageways by the light of the torch that they were carrying. He followed them to the entrance of a magnificent cavern that was probably once a reservoir of water, but now it was the great palace of the goblins. It rose to a tremendous height and was lit up by the many torches that all these goblins were crowded together and carrying. So Curdy could see what was going on, and he listened carefully to this meeting of the goblin government. At the other end of this grand hall was a ledge that came out from the cave wall, and on it sat the king and his court. And the king sat on a huge chunk of copper green ore that they had carved into a throne. And a court member was making a speech. He addressed the crowd saying, "It appears that 2 plans have been for some time coming together, thanks to His Majesty, for the deliverance of his people. Regardless of the fact that we were the first professors of the region above us, and regardless of the fact that we abandoned the region for loftier motives, and regardless also of the fact that we far excel them in mental ability, they look upon us as a degraded race and make a mockery of our feelings. But now the time is almost here, thanks to His Majesty's genius, that we will have our revenge once and for all." The court member also told the crowd that His Majesty's plans could never fail, but just in case they did, they had a backup plan. And someone yells out and they say, "Does it have something to do with the build-up of water in the natural reserves?" And the court member says, "Well, not to give too much away, but yes." Now Curdy could tell that the assembly was coming to an end and he better get out of there. So he crawled back through the hole he had created, and then he put a boulder through it so that the goblins wouldn't know that anyone had ever been there. Now, while Curdy understood what their backup plan was, he didn't know what their initial plans were. Curdy, being a miner, knew how dangerous water could be in a cave. He knew that if the reserves in the mountain ever came loose, it would drown all of the miners within an hour. But he also knew that there was no immediate danger at the moment because, this plan with the water reserves was contingent upon the failure of this first unknown plan. So Curdy knew he needed to come back and try and figure out what their initial plan is. But first, he had to run home and tell his parents everything. Now, both his parents agreed that they needed to figure out what these plans were. So Curdy spent many late nights in the mines trying to hopefully overhear some conversations. He would crawl through the hole that he had created and wander around the goblin territory, hoping to see or hear anything going on. And he would use a ball of string to mark his way back. He would tie one end of it to his pickaxe and leave his pickaxe at the hole he had crawled through. And then as he was moving around the caverns, he would let the ball of string unwind. That way he could follow it back to the hole he crawled through. Now, the first couple of nights he came across nothing, but finally one evening he came upon a group that were picking and digging at the rock, much like how the miners do to mine the ore. But this was confusing to Curdy because the goblins didn't mine the ore. They didn't use it for anything. So he didn't know why they were doing this. So he kept coming back every evening, hoping that he would overhear some kind of conversation or something to explain why they had been picking at the rock. Now, usually on his way back, his ball of string would get very tangled up because, he was in a hurry not to be seen. And he would go home and it would just be a big tangled mess. And he'd be so tired, he would just leave it. He was like, I'll get to it in the morning, wind it back up. But when he would get up, he'd find that at some point in the night, his mother had wound it back up for him, and it was in a nice, neat little ball. He'd be like, Mom, how did you do this? And she'd just be like, I just followed the thread. Now back to Irene. One night when she was sleeping, one of the goblin's little creatures came in her window. It was like a cat-like creature with super long legs, and it scared the hell out of her. And she went running out of the castle. And she ran down the road in the rain. And when she had gotten away, she looks down and she's all wet and muddy. So she decided to go to her grandmother's for help. So she goes back into the castle. Nobody had even noticed that she was gone. And she makes her way to her grandmother's room. And her grandmother, when she sees her, she feels bad for her. She cleans her up. And then she tells the princess, she's like, I have a gift for you. Apparently, what she had been spinning this whole time was for Princess Irene. Her grandmother goes to a cabinet and she pulls out a beautiful, shiny, silvery ball, and she gives it to the princess. Then she also gives the princess a beautiful ring to wear. The princess puts the ring on, and then the grandmother takes the shiny ball back and she puts it back into the cabinet. And Princess Irene is like, oh, I'm confused. I thought the ball was for me as well. And her grandmother says, oh, it is for you, but it has to stay here with me. She says, feel the ring and you'll see that it's attached to the shiny ball. So Princess Irene, she feels around her ring, and she does. She feels like a little thread going from her ring to the cabinet that the shiny ball is in. And Irene looks and she's like, I can't see anything. And her grandmother's like, oh, of course not. You can't see such a thin thread, but you can always feel it. Then she told Irene, she's like, if you ever find yourself frightened like you did tonight, take off the ring, put it under your pillow, and then follow the thread wherever it goes, no matter how roundabout the path seems. Just trust the thread. And Princess Irene said she would. Then the princess notices that her grandmother is wearing a beautiful crown. She also notices that her grandmother looks a lot younger than the last time she saw her. And she asks her grandmother, she says, is it the crown that makes you look so young? And her grandmother says, no, it's because I felt so young that I put on the crown. And Irene is like, why do you call yourself old? She's like, you don't look old. You look like you're 23. And her grandmother's like, well, you know, actually I am old. But she says, it's silly that people think that old means crooked and withered and feeble and canes and spectacles and rheumatism and forgetfulness. Old age has nothing to do with any of that. Old age means strength and beauty and courage. I'm much older than you think. And Irene gives her a big hug, and then her grandmother takes her back to her room to go back to sleep. Now this whole time, Curdy had been going back to the caves every night to try and figure out the goblin's plan still. And he was still using his string to guide his way. He would tie it to one end of his pickaxe and, put it into the rock at the entrance of the cave, and then let the string unravel as he was winding through these caves. Now one of these times, somehow, he didn't know how, his pickaxe got moved, and the string ended up leading him straight into the private apartment of the royal goblin family. He was standing on a protrusion of rock and could see down into their apartment. And he was kind of stretching his neck so he could hear what they were saying. But then all of a sudden, he slipped down the side of the cave wall. And he scared the goblins. And when they saw him, they thought that he was there to attack them. And they asked him, what are you doing in our kingdom? And he was like, oh, hey. He's like, I'm just a miner. I got lost. And the goblin king is like, well, you need to get out of my kingdom. And Curdy was like, no problem. If you could just show me the way out. And the king's like, oh, I'll show you the way out. And then he lets out this loud, howling roar. And within a few seconds, tons of goblins come swarming into their apartment. And they surround Curdy, and his back is up against the cave wall. And Curdy tells him to stand back. But they didn't. They just grinned and closed in on him. But then Curdy remembered, oh yeah, the singing. And he began to sing his little song that he'd been singing earlier. Now at first, the goblins did kind of shrink back and cover their ears and grinded their teeth like they'd eaten something bad. But remember, the tricks that work above ground don't work down there. So they only shrank back for a few moments and then were able to seize him. And they threw him into a hole in the side of the wall. And they threw him so hard that he hit his head and he got a little dizzy and disoriented. But he could hear them push a rock up against the hole in the wall. And he felt around and he could feel like the side of a slab that they had pushed up. And he tried to push it over with his shoulder, but then he could tell that they had piled up a bunch of smaller rocks behind it. So Curdy knew he was in an evil plight, and he sat down to try and think of how to get out of it. But he soon fell asleep in the pitch dark. Now the next morning, the princess woke up. She was terribly frightened by a noise that she had heard. Apparently the castle's cat and dog were fighting and had stumbled into her room, scaring her awake. And she remembered something that her grandmother had told her, that if she was ever frightened, to take the ring off, put it under her pillow, and then follow the thread. So that's what she does. She takes the ring off, she puts it under the pillow, she puts on her shoes, and then she starts to follow the thread. Now she expected the thread to take her to her grandmother, but it didn't. It took her straight out of the castle, out of the courtyard, and to the side of the mountain. Now the thread led her a good distance. It led her down the road where she had met Curdie, and the path got more and more rugged as she went on. And it got rougher and steeper as it took her up the mountain. And Irene started to get a little nervous since she was so far from home. But she trusted the thread and she kept going. And she realized that the thread was taking her into a hole in the side of the mountain. And she went in confidently. She followed that thread right into the mountain. Now once inside the mountain, she did get a little frightened as she continued to follow the thread deeper and deeper into the darkness. But she kept thinking about her grandmother and everything she had said to her, even when the path got very steep and rough. And at times she'd even have to go down a ladder. She had to crawl through sand and clay and rock until she came to a small hole that she had to crawl through. After that, she must have turned 100 different ways. But she kept following the thread. Finally, it led into a cavern where there was a fire burning. And the thread led into a heap of stones where it vanished. And for a moment, she thought that maybe her grandmother had forsaken her, leading the thread into a place she couldn't follow. She sat down and she began to sob. Then she had a thought. Maybe she could just follow the thread back home. So she got up and she found the thread and she started to follow it away from the rocks with her finger. But as she walked along, she found that the thread disappeared. She could only feel the thread if she was walking towards the stones where it disappeared. Then she really became upset and she threw herself on the stones and started to cry. And as she's crying, she's thinking to herself that surely her grandmother's thread didn't lead her here for no reason. So she starts to kind of finger and poke at the stones where the thread is disappeared at. Now the little rocks and pebbles started to fall away. And then she came upon, slightly bigger rocks. And then rocks that she needed 2 hands to move aside and throw to the floor. And as she worked her way through the rubble, she started to hear singing. Then the singing stopped. Curdie could hear her moving the rocks aside, and he thought it was the goblins. Then Irene realized who the voice was. And she goes, "It's Curdie." And Curdie says, "Shh, shh, quiet." He's like, "The goblins don't know you're here. Speak softly. And who are you, by the way?" And the princess is like, "It's Irene." And she's like, "I know who you are. You're Curdie." And Curdie's like, "How did you get here?" She's like, "My great-great-grandmother sent me." And Curdie's like, "I don't know what you're talking about there, but we'll figure it out once we get out of here." And he told her to move as many of the rocks aside as she could. And then he might be able to push the slab over. So that's what they did. Curdie was able to push the slab over, and then he crawled out of the hole. He's like, "Irene," he's like, "you saved my life." And she's like, "Well, I'm so glad." She's like, "But let's get out of this horrible place." And he's like, "Well, that's easier said than done. And she said, oh no, actually it's quite easy. All we have to do is follow my thread. And then she crawls into the hole that Curdy had just crawled out of. And Curdy's like, where are you going? He's like, that's not the way out. And Princess Irene is like, but it's where my thread goes and I have to follow it. Now Curdy thought this kid was crazy, but he decided to follow her and show her that that wasn't the way out. And then they could, you know, turn around and actually get to work on getting out of there. So he crawls over the slab and back into the hole he just crawled out of. And he had grabbed a torch from the fire that had been burning. And he's in the back in the hole and he's looking around and he can't see Irene anywhere. But he does see a tiny little hole that he hadn't noticed before since it had been so dark. So he crawls through the hole and he catches up to Irene. So he followed Irene since she seemed to know where she was going, even though he had no idea how she knew. And they made their way into a very large cavern. Irene goes walking across it perfectly confident. And Curdy, he follows her and he's looking around with his torch. And then they see where they are. They were in the royal family's bedroom. The king and queen were laying on a raised platform of rocks with sheepskins covering it. He also saw that his pickaxe was leaned up against the side of the bed right next to the queen. Then Irene notices these creatures, and this is her first time ever seeing a goblin. So of course the look on her face was frightful. But Curdy says, quiet, and he gives her his torch and tells her to hold it low so that it doesn't shine, you know, on their faces and wake them. And he was going to try and get his pickaxe. But right as he got a hold of it, the queen shot up in bed, and then the king next to her, and they saw Curdy and Irene. Curdy yelled at Irene to run. Irene holds out her hand to him and he grabs it, and they made their way out with Irene still being guided by the thread. And Irene says to Curdy, she's like, we're going to be fine, as they're running along. And he's like, oh yeah, how do you know that? And she goes, because my grandmother is taking care of us. And Curdy's like, that doesn't make sense. He's like, I don't know what you're talking about. And Irene says, well, if you don't know what I'm talking about, how do you know it doesn't make sense? She was a little offended. Now they ended up losing the goblins and started to walk along. And as they did, Curdy told Irene everything that he knew about goblins. He also told her everything that had happened to him since they had seen each other, you know, that night on the mountain. And when he finished, Irene told Curdy all about how she had come to rescue him. Now the story didn't make a whole lot of sense to Curdy, and he didn't believe half of it. So all he said was, well, you know, I don't get it. And Irene was like, well, I do. So don't worry, we'll be out of here soon. Now finally, they made their way out into the sunshine, and after their blindness faded away, they found that they were in the castle's courtyard. And Irene was like, see, do you believe me now? And Curdy's like, well, you know, it's not exactly that I don't believe you. He was like, I believe that you believe that what you're saying is true. And the princess is like, well, then I guess you'll just have to believe without seeing. Or I could take you to my grandmother and I can prove it. And Curdy was like, well, you know, I should be getting back to my parents. They're probably worried about me. But he had a hard time saying no to the princess. So he ended up following her to her grandmother's. Now, when they got to her grandmother's chambers, she runs up to her grandmother and she gives her a big hug. And she said, grandmother, this is Curdy. He didn't believe, you know, everything that I told him. So I brought him up here so he could see for himself. And her grandmother looks at Gertie and she says, "Oh, I see." She says, "But people must believe what they can, and those who believe more must not be hard upon those who believe less. I doubt you would have believed it all for yourself if you hadn't seen it for yourself first." And Irene's like, "Yeah, you're right." Then she turns to Gertie and she's like, "Say hello to my grandmother." And Gertie looks a little bewildered. All he could see was a little girl talking with her invisible friend. And Gertie's like, "I see no grandmother." And Irene is like, "What?" And then she realizes that, for her not to believe him would be just as bad as him not believing her. So she says, "Well, what do you see?" He said that he just saw an empty room that was bigger than his whole house. And he said that he didn't appreciate the princess telling lies to him. And then he turned around to leave. And Irene looks at her grandmother and she goes, "What do I do?" And her grandmother told her, she said, "Well, you kind of just have to let him go for now. You have to just be content with not being believed for a while." She's like, "I know it's hard, but you can do it." So Gertie, he leaves kind of pissed off. And Irene says to her grandmother, she says, "I thought you would have believed me." And her grandmother's like, "I know, child, and you will see what will come of it. But in the meantime, you must be content to be misunderstood for a while. We are all very anxious to be understood, and it is very hard not to be. But there is one thing much more important." And Irene is like, "Really? What's that?" And she says, "To understand other people." Then there's kind of this odd scene where the grandmother gives Irene a bath. And when she's in the bath, she's floating through space and completely relaxed and weightless. And when she gets out of the bath, she says that she feels like she's been made over, that she's completely renewed. And then she has the most soundest sleep of her whole life. So Gertie goes back home and he tells his parents everything, including all the lies that Irene told him. But he had to confess something. He was like, how can a child who knows nothing of the mountain lead us straight out of it with no mistakes? And his mother answered, "Well, she did take you out. You have no right to say what she told you was not true. Something had to have guided her. Maybe it was a thread or a rope or something else. If there is something you cannot explain, then her explanation may be the right one. At least she has an explanation, unlike you." And he's like, "But that's no explanation. I can't believe that." And his mother's like, "Well, maybe you can't believe simply because you can't understand." She's like, "You should apologize to her." And his father is like, "Well, what about the goblin's plans? Did you ever find out anything?" And Gertie told them that through bits of conversations that he'd overheard here and there, that he thinks he knows what their plan is. Their plan is to dig up under the castle, come up into it, grab the princess, steal her, and then marry her to the goblin prince. And then they would have some sort of claim to the kingdom. Now, for some time, the kingdom was very quiet. And during this time, Gertie was dealing with quite a bit of guilt about having not believed the princess and for storming out on her. But this actually made his efforts to serve her more diligent. He felt so bad about it. He would talk to his mother about it quite often. And she always assured him that he would get his chance to apologize to her and make things right. So he spent his days keeping a close eye on the excavation efforts of the goblins. And they had continued to dig down deeper and deeper. But then one day they leveled out and started digging at a very steep incline. And he was pretty sure that his hunch was right, that they were trying to dig up underneath the castle. So one evening, he snuck into the castle garden to try and hear what they were doing, and he put his ear to the ground. But the castle guards caught him thinking that he was a thief, and in their little struggle, Curdy's leg got wounded. Now, when everyone had heard about this thief that got caught, everyone wanted to get a look at him. And when Ludi saw him, she was like, "That's the kid that tried to kiss the princess." And of course, this upset the guards a little. So they dressed his wound and then they threw him into a spare room until they could figure out what to do with him. And as they're dragging him away, he's trying to tell them about what's going on with the goblins, and he's urging them, they're after the princess and blah, blah, blah. But they just laughed at him. And so now Curdy knew what it was like to not be believed. Now he ended up falling asleep, and he dreamed that a woman with white hair came into his room, took the dressings from his wound, rubbed it with something that smelt like roses, and waved her hand over his leg 3 times, and then his wound completely vanished. Then he suddenly woke up. He could hear that the house was in an uproar. He could hear people running around and the clashing and clanging of weapons, and he could hear men yelling and women crying and weird roaring, bellowing sounds. The goblins were in the castle. So he jumps out of bed and he puts on his shoes that are now armed with nails. I don't know when that happened. He finds a short sword that's hanging on the wall. He grabs it and he goes running out of the room, down the stairs towards the sound of strife. I guess the guards never locked the door. Maybe because they thought he was too wounded to escape. Now, once he got to the ground floor, there were guards and goblins fighting all over the place. And Curdy yells out, he's like, "Stamp on their feet, stamp on their feet." And when all the guards catch on, they were able to chase them back down into the hole that they had come up through in the wine cellar. Now, once all the goblins were gone, Curdy yells out, he's like, "Where's the princess?" And they start searching all over for her. They go to her bedroom and she's not there either. And it looks like there was some kind of a scuffle or something. And so they all figured that the goblins had already carried her off. And Curdy is determined to rescue her just like she had rescued him, or die trying. Now, as he's standing in her bedroom thinking this, he feels something brush against his hand. And he looks down, but he can't see anything. He feels it again, and it feels like a tight thread. And he knows immediately this is the princess's thread. But he doesn't tell anybody because he knows that nobody will believe him, just like he didn't believe the princess. So he follows the thread with his finger, and he follows it up the side of the mountain, and it takes him straight to his own house. And when he goes inside, he sees his mother cradling the little princess. And he walks up to her quietly. He doesn't want to wake her. But she opens her eyes and she sees him. She's like, "Oh, Curdy." She's like, "I'm so glad you're here." And he says to her, he's like, "I'm so sorry that I didn't believe you." But the princess forgave him, said it was no big deal. I mean, how could he have believed her? Then he asked the princess, he's like, "How did you get here?" And the princess told him that, she had woken up. She had heard the commotion going on in the house and it scared her. So she followed her grandmother's thread and it led her there. Then the princess asked Curdy how he came to find her there. And he told her all about how the goblins had attacked the house, how he had been watching out for her, and how he got captured by the guards, and about the thread. And she asks Curdie, she's like, why did the goblins attack my house? And he told her, you know, about their plan to kidnap her and make her their prince's wife. And she was like, oh God, that's terrible. Then Curdie told her about his dream, about the old lady coming into his room and healing his leg. And then he showed his leg to Irene and his mother, and how it was completely healed except for a scar. And Irene was like, oh, that was my grandmother. And Curdie believed her. So Curdie's mother tells him that he needs to take Irene home because the king is probably worried sick about her. And Curdie started to, but then a storm came and he couldn't get her back down the mountain safely. So they had to wait till the morning. So the next morning, Curdie's father, he goes to work in the mines like usual, and Curdie and his mother take Irene back home. But all the rivers and brooks were swollen and treacherous from the storm the night before. And several times Curdie had to carry the princess through very fast moving water. But they did make it to the castle safely. When they got there, the princess, seeing her father, goes running to him with her arms out. She's like, here I am, father. And he and the whole house were so relieved to see her. They all started cheering and celebrating. And Irene told her father and everyone there what Curdie had done for her. And then everyone started cheering and praising Curdie. Then Irene told her father that she wanted to give Curdie a kiss. And her father allowed it. So she gave him a kiss on the mouth and said, there, Curdie, she said, there's the kiss that I promised you. And then everyone went in the house to celebrate. And they sent for Curdie's father and all the other miners, and they had a grand feast that lasted long into the night. Now, as the party was drawing to an end, Irene goes up to her father and she's like, do you hear that sound? And everyone's ears perked up. And the king says, like it kind of sounds like thunder. Maybe there's another storm coming. But then Curdie remembered the goblin's backup plan. And he puts his ear to the ground and he can hear rushing water. So Curdie goes up to the king and he's like, please, your majesty, he's like, you got to get everyone out of here. And the king was a wise king, and so he listened to Curdie and he told everyone to follow him outside into the night. Now, after they reached the gate and they were crossing out of the courtyard, they could hear the water coming for them and the ground started to tremble. And just as the last of them were crossing out of the courtyard, a big gush of water came barreling through and almost swept them away. But everyone got out safe and they went up the side of the mountain as the torrent was rising. Then the king, Curdie, and the guards went and got the horses, knowing they would need them because they were probably going to need to get to even higher ground. Curdie told the king everything about the goblins' second backup plan, that they had resolved to execute it if they had failed at carrying off the princess. He knew that the goblins had let loose all of the mountain's reservoirs and streams in order to flood their kingdom, and the castle was in danger of falling as the torrent was going to be rising. So they knew they were going to have to set out to one of their other castles in order to keep Irene safe. And as Irene and the king are mounting their horses, Curdie and Irene see a shining white light over the house. And they know that this is Irene's grandmother. They also saw a bunch of dead goblins floating in the water. They had been caught up in their own snare. They ended up flooding their own kingdom, and they were swept up and drowned. Then the king, being very impressed by Curdie, asked him to join his guard and to be trained for a promotion. But Curdie didn't want to leave his family, and the king and the princess respected that. But Curdie did ask that they come and visit in the summer, and the king and Curdie said that they would try their best. The king also asked Curdie to oversee the rebuilding of his castle and to make sure that all his servants were taken care of. And then the king and Irene and all their company rode off into the starry night. Now, a few of the goblin creatures had escaped the mountain, but most of them that survived left the country, and the few that stayed kept a very low profile. And soon enough, they all but disappeared. And as for Curdie and the princess, well, that's a story for another time. The end. I thought this was the cutest little fairy tale. I really liked the lesson. I think the lesson is to follow the thread. Trust where your life is taking you without judgment, which is definitely a lesson I needed to hear lately. I also really liked the scene, the whole bath scene. It was a little weird, but I thought it was very like symbolic of like a baptism. And I thought it was interesting that it wasn't discovering her faith that renewed her, but when she came to the acceptance of the faithless, that she felt renewed and made whole. Now, obviously, also there is a second story to this, which I got on Amazon and bought as soon as I finished this one, and I cannot wait to read that one. We'll be doing it. There's also a very strange movie. I can't remember what year it's from. It's very old. A cartoon that is based on this story. It's a little weird, but I'll link it in the description if you want to see it. It might help you understand the story a little. But yeah, I thought it was a great fairy tale. I loved it, and I am so super happy that I got to share it with you. Let me know if you've read this book, what you thought, if you got the same kind of message that I do. I thought it was a fairly obvious message. It seemed like they were pushing it pretty hard. Also, if there are any other books, any other fairy tales, or any kind of book really, that you would like me to cover on this channel, let me know in the comments. And if you liked this video, let me know by giving it a like. It's how I know what kind of videos to make, what I should be spending my time on for you. Also, make sure and subscribe and hit the notifications bell so you don't miss another episode of Beauty and the Bibliophile, another fairy tale. And I will see you in the next one. Bye. And they took... She's like... And Princess is like... It appears that two plants have been... It appears that two... Oh my God, what? But including... Then Turdy...